Eleanor Whitmore, billionaire, real estate empress worth hundreds of millions, ordered 10 luxury cars removed from her private collection on a single Tuesday morning. No auction, no donation. Simply discarded the way a person discards a pair of old shoes. Jackson Cole, a single father with nothing but calloused hands and a rented garage, happened to stand before that pile of condemned machines. 10 cars declared dead, and in his eyes, not one of them was broken. They were waiting to be brought back. The only question remaining was whether he had the courage to bet everything on that belief. What happens when the contempt of the wealthy becomes the launching pad for a man with nothing? Find out now. The garage sat at the end of a dead-end road on the outer rim of Detroit, hemmed in by a salvage yard on one side and a shuttered auto parts store on the other. Jackson Cole rented the space from a landlord who had told him twice that he was selling the property before the year was out. The rent was low enough that Jackson could manage it, high enough that he could not save beyond it. He was 34 years old, and the calloused state of his hands told the story of a man who had been working on engines since before he was legally allowed to drive one. He had a son at home, a boy he worked 12-hour days to protect from the particular instability that arrives when a father stops showing up, and Jackson Cole had no intention of ever being that kind of man. He was the older kind of mechanic, the kind who pressed a palm flat against an engine block and felt the difference between a problem and a death sentence, who believed without irony that there was no such thing as a broken car, only a car that had not yet found the right person. He had held that belief through a divorce, through the slow death of the neighborhood shop, through the years when the dealerships absorbed every customer who could afford to be absorbed. 3 miles northwest, in a building that cost more to heat per month than Jackson earned in a year, Eleanor Whitmore was running through a Tuesday with the same efficiency she applied to every other day. She was 41, dark-haired, and possessed of a quality that the people who worked for her either admired or feared. She did not revisit decisions. The Whitmore Group had grown from a single commercial property in her late 20s into a portfolio that included 11 mixed-use developments and 4 pending acquisitions, and she had built it by being fast, by delegating correctly, and by refusing to spend a single hour on a problem that could be solved in 3 minutes. Her assistant, Giselle Marsh, was 29 and efficient in the way people are efficient when they understand that proximity to power depends on being indispensable. She managed Eleanor's calendar, her correspondence, and the long tail of small decisions that a woman like Eleanor could not afford to waste attention on. It was Giselle who had compiled the report on the lakeside storage facility, a unit Eleanor had rented 3 years earlier when her car collection outgrew her main garage. The collection had been a passing interest, bought the way she sometimes bought art, because the pieces were rare and because she could. But a passing interest is still passing, and by the time Giselle placed the summary on her desk, Eleanor had not thought about those cars in longer than she could remember. The summary was 2 pages. Eleanor read through it in under 90 seconds. She picked up a pen, wrote a single word at the top, and handed it back. The word was dispose. Carter Voss had worked for Eleanor Whitmore for 12 years. He was 45, silver-haired, and carried the unhurried confidence that accumulates in men who manage other people's wealth long enough to begin believing some of it belongs to them by association. His official title was Asset Management Advisor. In practice, he was the person Eleanor trusted to handle disposals, transfers, and the paperwork-heavy decisions she had neither the time nor the patience to supervise. When Giselle forwarded him the Lakeside file, he opened it at his desk with his usual casual expression. That expression lasted approximately 30 seconds. He recognized 3 of the names on that list immediately. A 1966 Ferrari 275 GTB, a 1964 Aston Martin DB5, and a 1961 Jaguar E-Type Series 1. And he understood, without any ambiguity, that each of those vehicles, fully restored and sold through the right channels, could bring between $500,000 and over $1 million. The combined value of those 3 alone exceeded the annual revenue of several of Eleanor's smaller properties. The maintenance report accompanying each vehicle was brief and damning. The Ferrari was marked severe gearbox oil leak. The Aston Martin carried a notation of complete electrical failure throughout. The Jaguar was listed as having structural frame distortion. Any layperson reading those descriptions would conclude the cars were beyond practical recovery. Carter had not written the reports, but he had read them before Giselle compiled the summary, and he had said nothing to correct the impression they created. He called a salvage and demolition company he had used on previous jobs, a firm run by a man named Grant Holloway, and gave instructions to collect all 10 vehicles from Lakeside but hold the 3 flagged units in a separate staging location. He would arrange their purchase through a private acquisition vehicle at scrap metal pricing. The paperwork would be clean, the profit would be substantial, the entire operation would be invisible to Eleanor Whitmore, who had already signed and moved on. The plan required only one thing to work: no interference. Grant Holloway sent his crew to Lakeside on a Wednesday morning. The crew chief was a man named Dennis Bennett. Dennis had a brother named Lucas, and Lucas Bennett had a best friend who knew more about old cars than anyone else in the state of Michigan. Dennis called Lucas from the parking lot of the Lakeside facility before his crew had finished unloading. He said very little on the phone, just that Lucas needed to come, and to bring Jackson. Lucas drove 40 minutes across the city, walked through the facility's side entrance, and stood in the cold dark between 2 rows of covered shapes. He lifted the nearest tarp, turned on his phone's flashlight, and stood there for a while without saying anything at all. He called Jackson at 11:15 that night. Jackson was still in the garage, working on a customer's transmission under a clip-on lamp. He did not want to drive across the city at that hour. Lucas said 4 words that changed his mind. "I'm not kidding, Jackson. The drive took 32 minutes. When Jackson stepped through the side door of the Lakeside facility and the flashlight swept across the first row of vehicles, he stopped walking. He did not speak for almost a full minute. He stood in front of the covered form of the Ferrari, and something moved through him that was not quite recognizable as emotion and not quite recognizable as calculation. It sat in the specific place where a craftsman encounters something worth saving. He reached out and set one hand flat on the canvas cover. Then he turned to Lucas and said, "Who owns these?" They worked through the rest of the night. Jackson moved from car to car with the methodical focus of a man who had been waiting his entire working life for a problem this serious. He did not have diagnostic equipment. He did not need it. 34 years of mechanical intuition lived in his hands, and what his hands told him as he moved across each vehicle was the same thing, car after car in different registers. These machines were not broken. They were dormant. The Ferrari's gearbox seal was dry-rotted, a consequence of years without operation, not of any catastrophic failure. The Aston Martin's electrical system had collapsed, but the cause was a section of wiring harness chewed through by rodents, severing fuse chains in a cascade that looked catastrophic on paper and was entirely traceable in person. The Jaguar's frame carried a slight bend in a secondary crossmember. Not the structural rail, not the chassis backbone. A support component that had been tagged as frame distortion by someone either deeply unfamiliar with the vehicle or deeply motivated to make it sound unfixable. Jackson crouched under the Jaguar for 11 minutes. When he straightened up, he wrote 2 words in his small notebook: "One afternoon." He filled 4 pages before sunrise. When he finally sat down on the concrete floor with his back against the wall, Lucas handed him a bottle of water and waited. Jackson stared at the ceiling, then said, "Every single one of these cars was deliberately described as worse than it is." Lucas asked how he could be sure. Jackson opened the notebook because every problem on this list has a simple answer. Nobody who knows cars writes a report this wrong by accident. In the morning, Jackson found the crew chief and made his proposal. He would purchase all 10 vehicles outright at salvage value, eliminating the company's transport and processing costs. Dennis called it in. The call was routed to Giselle Marsh, who was managing 17 other items for Eleanor, and made the decision in 45 seconds. If the buyer was paying cash and handling removal, the answer was yes. Jackson drove to the bank that same morning and withdrew every dollar of his savings. He called Lucas from the parking lot. Lucas met him there and signed a personal loan agreement on the hood of his truck. Together they assembled $47,000. Jackson's entire reserve and Lucas's entire buffer, 2 years of financial security dissolved into a single transaction. Jackson signed the purchase agreement without hesitation. He did not tell anyone how close to the edge that signature put him. He did not need to. The vehicles were moved to a larger rented warehouse on the eastern side of the city, secured month to month from a property manager who did not ask many questions. Jackson wrote a deadline on the inside cover of his notebook: 18 months. He did not tell Lucas about the deadline. Lucas could read the math. Carter Voss discovered the breach 4 days later. His contact at the demolition company reported that all 10 vehicles had been purchased and removed by a private buyer before Carter's separate arrangement could be completed. Carter asked for the name. The contact said, Jackson Cole. Carter typed it into a search engine. A basic business registration appeared. A one-man mechanic operation in outer Detroit, no notable history. Carter told himself that a man like that would not know what he was holding. He told himself there was still time. He instructed his assistant to pull everything available on Jackson Cole, then went to a dinner that had been on his calendar for 2 months, ordered the salmon, and did not mention the cars to anyone at the table. Jackson began the restorations on a Monday. He arrived at the warehouse at 6 in the morning and spent the first hour walking the 2 rows of covered vehicles in silence, thinking. He had already decided the sequence. Start with the car that could generate cash fastest, because without cash flow the other 9 would deteriorate in storage while he deteriorated in debt. He pulled the cover off the Ferrari, folded it carefully and set it on a shelf. Then he rolled his toolbox into position. The gearbox seal replacement took 3 days, not because it was complicated, but because Jackson worked the way he had always worked, completely, without shortcuts, checking each adjacent component as he moved through the repair rather than fixing only what the report described. He found 3 additional issues during that process: a degraded brake line junction, a fuel delivery filter seized from disuse, and wheel bearings that had begun to corrode. None of them had been in the original report. All of them were repaired. He photographed the finished Ferrari and posted the images to a collector forum under his own name, with a brief description. 1966 Ferrari 275 GTB, full mechanical restoration, original matching numbers, drive-ready condition. The first response came within 2 hours. A collector in Dallas named Marcus Webb sent a message that began, "I've been looking for this exact car for 6 years. The call that followed lasted 40 minutes. At the end of it, Marcus said he would pay $380,000 for a full restoration to show quality. Paint, interior, mechanical, everything documented and certified. Jackson thanked him, said he would be in touch, and hung up. He sat on the concrete floor next to the Ferrari for a long time after that. He did the calculation in his head, then on paper, then again. If the Ferrari could bring $380,000 and the other 9 held anywhere near comparable value, he was holding a collection worth between $4 and $12 million. He had bought all of it for $47,000. Lucas arrived that afternoon and found Jackson still sitting on the floor. Jackson told him the number. Lucas sat down next to him and neither of them said anything for a while. The Aston Martin DB5 was next. Lucas spent 2 days sourcing original specification wiring harness components through a parts network he had maintained from his years importing European vehicle parts. When the correct components arrived, Jackson installed them with the same attention he had given the Ferrari. Not just replacing the failed section but tracing the entire electrical circuit by hand, rebuilding the system rather than patching it. When he turned the key for the first time and the engine caught and held, the sound was so clean and complete that both men stopped what they were doing and simply listened. The Jaguar came after. Jackson went under the frame on a Tuesday morning and came out that afternoon with the cross members straightened by hand. He was right, 1 afternoon was all it took. He had begun keeping a detailed log for each vehicle. Repair description, parts sourced, hours worked, total cost, and a notes section where he recorded what the original report had claimed against what he had actually found. The discrepancy was consistent across every car he touched. Each vehicle had language calculated to suggest irreparability. Each vehicle had turned out to be straightforward. Jackson was not a suspicious man by nature, but the notebook was becoming a document of a particular kind of pattern, and patterns have a way of meaning something even before the meaning becomes clear. One evening, Lucas brought a printout from the collector forum. Someone had written a short paragraph about a mechanic in Detroit restoring cars the market had written off, calling the work the most thorough mechanical restoration this community has seen in 15 years. Jackson picked it up, read it, folded it carefully, and put it in the front pocket of his work shirt. Carter Voss had been patient for 3 weeks. His investigator produced a detailed report. 2 men working an intensive schedule in an East Side warehouse, regular parts deliveries, 3 vehicles already confirmed as fully functional by the collector community. Carter read the report on a Saturday morning and understood that he had underestimated the situation. He had assumed a mechanic without resources would stall within the first month. He had been wrong. He would not make the same mistake twice. He engaged a smaller legal practice that specialized in asset recovery disputes and presented the situation with selective detail. The central question was this: could a transaction authorized by an executive assistant, without explicit written delegation from the principal party, be subject to a validity challenge? The attorney reviewed the documentation and gave a careful answer. The delegation of authority in Giselle Marsh's employment agreement was broad but not unlimited. A sufficiently motivated challenge could argue that a disposal of assets exceeding 6 figures required direct principal authorization. The challenge would not be strong, but it would be sufficient to trigger a temporary freeze on sales activity while the court reviewed the matter. Carter did not need to win. He needed time. He needed Jackson Cole unable to sell a single car while the legal process worked its slow machinery, long enough for Carter to build a parallel approach that would either acquire the vehicles through Eleanor directly or force Jackson into a settlement. The legal letter went out on a Thursday. It arrived at the warehouse on a Monday morning, delivered by a courier who had to knock twice before Lucas answered the door. Lucas read it standing in the doorway. He read it twice. Then he walked inside and set it on the workbench next to the Porsche 356 Jackson was currently examining. Jackson read it once, set it down, picked up his wrench, and went back to the Porsche. Lucas watched him for a moment. "You're not going to say anything?" Jackson put down the wrench. "I don't have money for a good lawyer," he said. "That's what needs to be said." Lucas leaned against the wall. "There's someone I know. She's not a lawyer." Jackson looked up. "What does she do?" Lucas said, "She asks the right questions to the wrong people." Diana Sterling had been writing about financial misconduct for 11 years. She worked for an investigative publication with a small staff and a disproportionate reputation for the quality of its sourcing. She was 38, direct in a way that people in finance found either refreshing or alarming depending on which side of her work they were on, and she possessed the specific quality that all good investigators share. She never confused her conclusion with her evidence. When Lucas called and described the situation, she asked 4 questions. Then she said she would meet them at the warehouse the following day. She arrived in the early afternoon and spent the first 20 minutes walking the rows of cars without speaking. Then she sat at the workbench and went through Jackson's notebook page by page, the original assessment reports on one side, Jackson's findings on the other, the photographs documenting conditions found versus conditions described. She set the notebook down and said, "The discrepancy between these reports and your findings is too consistent to be incompetence." Jackson said he had been thinking the same thing. Diana said, "Who submitted the original assessments?" Neither of them knew. Diana said, "I'll find out." She left with the notebook. Jackson made her sign for it in writing. The legal freeze did not stop the work. It stopped the selling, but the restoration continued, and in some ways the enforced holding period made Jackson more thorough than he might have been under time pressure. The Porsche 356 Speedster required a rebuilt carburetor and new gaskets throughout the fuel system. The work took 4 days. The Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing, the car with the distinctive upward-opening doors, had a seized door release mechanism on the driver's side that required careful disassembly of the entire door panel to access the actuating cable. Jackson had never worked on a Gullwing before. He spent one evening reading every piece of available documentation about the door mechanism's construction before touching it. He did not rush. He got it right on the first attempt. The Lamborghini Miura had a fuel distribution problem that took him the better part of a week to isolate. A failed diaphragm valve in the secondary circuit intermittently blocking fuel delivery under load. The part was not commercially available. Jackson fabricated a replacement from raw stock. When Lucas saw the finished piece, he said, "That's the kind of thing people write books about." The remaining vehicles, a 1958 Alfa Romeo Giulietta Spider, a 1969 Ford GT40 road variant, a 1972 De Tomaso Pantera, and a 1949 Talbot Lago Grand Sport, each had their own specific histories of neglect, each required their own diagnosis, and each responded to careful work in the way machines respond when someone actually pays attention to what they need. Word continued to spread through the collector community without Jackson doing anything to accelerate it. A message arrived from a museum curator in Geneva asking about the Miura. A collector in London sent an inquiry about the Talbot Lago. A broker representing a private client in Tokyo asked whether the GT40 had been spoken for. Jackson did not respond to any of them while the legal freeze was in effect, but he kept every message in a folder and showed it to Lucas on a Friday evening. Lucas counted them, 14 inquiries, 7 different countries. Jackson said, "That's 11 cars. We only have 10. They stared at each other for a moment and then both of them laughed. The first real, unguarded laughter either of them had managed in weeks. Diana had spent 2 weeks running a different kind of investigation from the one Jackson was conducting. She was not looking at cars. She was looking at Carter Voss. She had encountered his name once before in a tangentially related context. a dispute over the disposal of a commercial property 3 years earlier that had ended in a quiet settlement and no published reporting. She began pulling the threads from that older case and found that the pattern bore a close resemblance to what the Lakeside Notebook was showing. Assets undervalued through selectively written technical reports, disposal authorization obtained at a remove from the principal party, and a secondary buyer arrangement structured to capture the spread. The more she read, the more clearly she understood that Lakeside was not an isolated incident. It was the latest in a sequence. Carter received Diana's first inquiry call on a Thursday afternoon. She identified herself and her publication and said she was writing about asset management practices in high-net-worth estates. She asked 3 questions, the last of which was, "Can you describe your role in the preparation of vehicle assessment documentation for the Whitmore Lakeside collection?" Carter said he had nothing to add and ended the call. He spent 20 minutes on the phone with his attorney, his voice lower and more careful than his attorney had ever heard it. The attorney said the legal challenge was still viable but that the timeline was narrowing. Jackson's legal counsel, a family law attorney named Rebecca Hart, who had agreed to take the case on an accelerated fee arrangement, had filed a response with the court that included the full transaction documentation, the text of Giselle Marsh's delegation agreement, and 12 photographs of the vehicles in current restored condition. The court had scheduled a 30-day review. Carter had started with considerably more time and had spent most of it underestimating the person on the other side. He decided there was one remaining move. He needed to speak with Eleanor directly before Diana Sterling did. He did not know that Diana had already booked the appointment. Carter moved first and called Jackson directly. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon. He said he represented interests connected to the Whitmore estate and was authorized to offer a buyout for the full 10 vehicles as at $150,000. Jackson said nothing for a moment. Carter filled the silence. "That's a 300% return on your initial outlay. You take it, you walk away clean," Jackson said. "Thank you for calling." He ended the call. He stood in the warehouse with the phone in his hand and looked at the 8 remaining cars in various states of restoration. $150,000 would cover his debts, repay Lucas, and leave him with a few thousand left over. It was the most financially rational option available to him at that exact moment. It was also precisely what someone was offering because they knew what the cars were actually worth. He put the phone in his pocket and walked back to the Alfa Romeo. The court issued a preliminary ruling on a Tuesday. The freeze on sales activity would remain in effect for an additional 30 days while the validity of the original transaction was reviewed. Jackson received the ruling by email. He read it standing at his workbench with the Talbot logo disassembled around him, parts laid out in careful sequence on a clean mat. He read it once, set his phone face down, and did not move for a moment. Then he picked up his tools and continued working. That night he sat at the folding table in the warehouse office, a plywood desk under a single bulb, and laid out his financial position on paper. The warehouse rent was current but would become overdue in 2 weeks. The outstanding parts invoices totaled $11,000. Lucas's loan was due in principal within 60 days. The legal fees for Rebecca Hart's work, even at the reduced arrangement, had already reached $4,000 and would continue to accrue. Jackson had no additional income while the freeze was in effect. He had shuttered his regular repair business for the duration of the project, a decision that had seemed reasonable at the start and felt very different now. He sat at that table for a long time. This was the specific kind of silence that comes not from peace but from the absence of any obvious path forward. The silence of a man who has done everything correctly and arrived at a position where correctness is not sufficient. He did not spiral. He simply sat with the actual numbers on the paper in front of him and worked through every combination until he had exhausted them. Then he put the paper in the notebook and turned off the light. Diana Sterling walked into the Whitmore Group's offices on a Wednesday afternoon and met Eleanor Whitmore for the first time. The stated purpose was a profile piece on asset portfolio strategy among principal-owned holding companies, a topic Eleanor was willing to discuss within carefully defined limits. They spoke for 30 minutes on that subject. Then Diana changed direction. She set 2 documents on Eleanor's desk side by side. On the left, a high-resolution photograph of the Ferrari 25 GTB fully restored, its paint throwing back the light of the flash in a way that made it look new from the factory. On the right, the original assessment report filed with Eleanor's office, bearing the processing stamp and the notation, "Severe gearbox oil leak, restoration not cost-effective." Diana said, "This photograph was taken last month." The vehicle in the image is one of the 10 from your lakeside collection. The assessment on the right is the document that informed your disposal decision. Eleanor looked at both documents without moving. "Where is this car now?" she said. Diana told her. Eleanor had a quality that made her unusual among people who had built what she had built. She was capable of genuine anger at herself. Not the performative accountability of public self-correction. Actual cold recognition that a decision had been made without sufficient information, and that this was her responsibility. She had signed the disposal order. She had not read the original assessments. She had trusted the process Carter Voss managed, and she had never thought to verify it because she had never had a reason to. She was thinking of reasons now. Diana asked, "Are you aware that a mechanic named Jackson Cole is currently facing a legal challenge to the validity of his purchase?" Eleanor said, "I was not aware of that." She asked who had initiated the challenge. Diana said she had documentation suggesting it had been filed through a firm connected to Carter Voss's professional relationships. Eleanor said, "Send me what you have." Diana said she would have it there by evening. They shook hands. Eleanor called Giselle before she was back in her own office. She said, "Pull everything on the lakeside transaction. Every document, every communication, every assessment report, and every record of contact between Carter Voss's office and anyone involved in that disposal from the point of my authorization forward." She went back to her desk. Outside, the lake was flat and gray under an October sky. She looked at it for a moment without really seeing it. Then she opened the Ferrari photograph and looked at it more carefully. The lines of it, the specific shade of red that she remembered seeing for the first time at a show in Monte Carlo the year before she bought it. She had never told anyone why she bought that car. It was not the kind of thing she generally discussed, but she remembered the exact feeling of the moment, and she recognized something like it, in a displaced form, in the photograph in front of her. The hour passed. Giselle set the compiled file on Eleanor's desk without speaking. Eleanor went through it with the same efficiency she applied to quarterly reports, but not the same detachment. Between the date of her signed authorization and the date the demolition crew arrived at Lakeside, Carter had exchanged 14 messages with Holloway's company. 11 routed through a secondary contact address not registered to any Whitmore Group account. The technical assessments had been processed through an external review contractor whose retainer agreement listed Carter Voss as the authorizing contact. She went back to the original reports. She cross-referenced the submission dates with Carter's internal calendar records. She closed the file. She did not call Carter that night. She called her primary legal counsel instead and spent 45 minutes in a quiet, methodical conversation about what the file contained. Her counsel confirmed the documentation was sufficient to support a formal complaint to the relevant financial oversight body. Eleanor said that was fine, but she had another matter to address first. She asked whether there was any procedural barrier to withdrawing the validity challenge currently before the court. Her counsel said none, if Eleanor filed a direct confirmation of the transaction's legitimacy. Eleanor said, "Draft it tonight." The confirmation was filed at 9:30 the following morning. It was 4 paragraphs long, signed by Eleanor Whitmore, and stated unambiguously that the sale of 10 vehicles from the Lakeside collection to Jackson Cole had been conducted within the proper scope of delegated authority, that the consideration paid was accepted as valid, and that the Whitmore Group withdrew all challenges to the transaction's standing. The court issued the corresponding order by early afternoon. The freeze was lifted. Jackson received a call from Rebecca Hart at 2:15. He was under the Alfa Romeo at the time, running a compression check. He came out, listened to Rebecca's explanation, and asked her to repeat the key sentence. The challenge had been withdrawn by Eleanor Whitmore herself, not by a ruling, not by a technicality. Jackson stood in the middle of the warehouse with grease on his forearms and the phone at his ear, and he did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you, Rebecca." He hung up. He went back to the Alfa Romeo, completed the compression check, and recorded the results in the notebook. Then he came out, washed his hands at the utility sink, and told Lucas. Lucas sat down on the overturned crate and put his face in his hands for a moment. When he looked up, he said, "Tell me the Dallas guy still wants the Ferrari." Marcus Webb drove up from Dallas 2 weeks later and paid $395,000 for the Ferrari 275 GTB, slightly above the original quote, because the collector community's awareness of Jackson's restoration work had grown, and Webb understood that thorough documented provenance increased a car's value. Jackson handed over the logbooks, the photographs, and the full written account of the repairs. Webb shook his hand at the warehouse door and said, "If you do any more of these, I want to know first." Jackson said, "You'll know." That evening, after Marcus Webb's trailer disappeared around the corner, Lucas went to his truck and came back with 2 bottles of soda and handed one to Jackson. They sat on the warehouse floor in the empty space where the Ferrari had stood for 6 months. Neither of them said much. The numbers did not need to be said aloud. They both knew what the next 9 sales would represent. Carter Voss was called to Eleanor's office on a Thursday morning. He came in with the same unhurried confidence he had carried into every meeting for 12 years, and Eleanor let him sit down before she placed the compiled file on the desk between them. She did not raise her voice. She outlined what the file contained, described the communications with Holloway's firm, and identified the external assessment contractor. Carter made 2 attempts to offer alternative framings. Eleanor said, "Don't." What followed was a practical discussion. His access to Whitmore Group systems was terminated effective that day. His employment agreement was voided under the misconduct provisions, and Eleanor's legal team would be in contact regarding the civil matter. Carter left the office 40 minutes after he had entered it. He did not take the photograph from his wall. Diana Sterling published her piece 3 weeks later. Not about Jackson Cole, but about the structural conditions that allowed asset managers within high net worth estates to manipulate disposal decisions for personal gain, using manufactured technical reports and opaque delegation chains. It named Carter Voss and documented his methods in source detail. The Lakeside collection was mentioned once, briefly, as the transaction that had exposed the pattern. Jackson's name appeared in a single sentence as the buyer. He read the piece at his workbench, folded it once, and put it in the notebook beside the forum print Lucas had given him months before. 18 months after the night, Jackson stood in the dark of the Lakeside facility with one hand on the canvas cover of the Ferrari, the last vehicle in the collection, the Talbot Lago Grand Sport. Was transferred to a private collector in Lyon who had been waiting since the day word reached Europe that the car existed. The total revenue from all 10 vehicles came to $10,300,000. After parts, labor, rent, legal fees, and repayment of all loans, the net figure was $8,700,000. Jackson sat with the final accounting for a long time before he felt anything about it. He bought the warehouse. He did not celebrate this. He signed the purchase agreement the same way he had signed every other important document in this chapter of his life, carefully and without flourish. He hired 3 mechanics, 2 young men from the neighborhood who had been doing work in their driveways, and a woman named Grace Hollis who had worked at a restoration shop in Cleveland and came recommended through the collector network. He gave all 3 a salary 15% above market rate and a clear description of how he expected work to be documented. Lucas Bennett became a formal co-owner of the business, with an equity stake calculated precisely from his original contribution and the risk it had represented. Lucas said the calculation was too generous. Jackson said it was the only calculation that made sense to him. They did not argue about it further, which was, in its way, a complete description of how they had always operated. Jackson built a documentation system that replaced the handwritten notebooks with a proper archival process. Photographs at every stage of each restoration, parts provenance records going back to the original manufacturer where possible, and a written narrative for every vehicle explaining exactly what had been found, what had been done, and why. He understood by this point that the value of his work was not only mechanical, it was evidentiary. The collector market paid for certainty, and Jackson had built a reputation for producing it. The garage on the dead-end road stayed open, managed by Grace when Jackson was occupied elsewhere. It still took in regular repair work, engines, transmissions, brake systems on the vehicles of neighborhood customers who could not afford dealership rates. He did not advertise this. The customers who had always come there continued to come, and some of them did not know that the quiet man under the car was the same person whose name had appeared in a collector publication described as having completed the most significant single collection restoration in the American private market in the past decade. He did not see any reason to tell them. Eleanor Whitmore made no public acknowledgement of the events. She handled the Carter Voss matter through her legal team and her financial oversight filings and did not discuss it externally. 6 months after the final vehicle sale, a plain white envelope arrived at the warehouse. Inside was a single document, the original auction receipt from the Aston Martin DB5's purchase at a London sale in 2009. The year Eleanor had closed her first major commercial deal, the first year she had understood concretely that the life she had been working toward was actually going to happen. She had bought the car in a single afternoon's decision because it was the first purely beautiful thing she had ever allowed herself to want. She had written 2 sentences on a card folded inside the receipt. She did not sign it. Jackson read the card once, set it on the desk, and looked out the warehouse window for a long moment. Then he placed the card and the receipt in the locked cabinet with the logbooks. The Aston Martin was in Geneva, in a private collection, driven once per month on Sunday mornings by a retired engineer who had restored his first car at 16 and understood that some machines carry more than mechanical history. Jackson did not know the specific details of this. He knew only that it was being cared for correctly, and that was sufficient. What a wealthy person discards because it no longer serves them is not, by that fact, without value. What looks like an ending from one vantage point is frequently a beginning from another. And the difference between those 2 vantage points is not money, and it is not circumstance. It is the willingness to put your hands on something the world has called finished and disagree.